Welcome back to Wild West Stories, where the forgotten tales of the American frontier come alive with all their raw justice, moral complexity, and human courage. I'm your storyteller, and today we're journeying to 1873 Arizona Territory, where the harsh desert sun exposed more than just the cracked earth. It revealed the true nature of those who called this unforgiving land home. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, 8 months pregnant and alone on her remote homestead after her husband's tragic death in what everyone believed was a mining accident. It's about the moment when a dying stranger's confession shattered everything she thought she knew about her loss. And it's about what happens when a grieving widow discovers that sometimes the only justice available is the kind you make with your own hands. In the Arizona Territory of 1873, the law was often a luxury that existed only in the larger settlements, leaving isolated homesteaders to face their demons and their enemies with nothing but their own courage and determination. Sarah's story reminds us that maternal instinct, when pushed beyond its limits, can transform the gentlest soul into a force of nature that even the hardest men learn to fear. So settle in for a tale that will challenge everything you think you know about mercy, motherhood, and the terrible price of frontier justice. Because what Sarah Mitchell did to the man who confessed to murdering her husband would become legend in a territory where legends were written in blood and carved into desert stone. Let's begin. The Arizona sun blazed down upon Sarah Mitchell's shoulders with the relentless intensity of divine judgment. Each burning ray a reminder that she was 8 months pregnant, utterly alone, and struggling to survive in a land that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. The year was 1873, and the desert stretched endlessly in all directions from her small homestead, a patch of stubborn earth that she and Tom had wrestled from the wilderness with nothing but hope, determination, and the kind of backbreaking labor that either killed a person or transformed them into something harder than the desert itself. 6 months had passed since the cave-in at the Copper Crown mine claimed her husband's life. 6 months of sleepless nights when she jolted awake, her hand instinctively reaching across the bed for the warm, solid presence that would never again share her dreams or ease her fears. 6 months of making every decision alone, from the mundane choices of what to cook for dinner to the life or death calculations of whether their dwindling savings would last through the winter. The Mitchell homestead bore the scars of a woman's solo struggle against impossible odds. The main house, built from adobe bricks that Tom had formed with his own hands, showed signs of deferred maintenance: shutters that hung slightly crooked, a roof that leaked in 3 places during the rare desert storms, and a front porch where loose boards creaked ominously under even Sarah's slight weight. The barn that housed their 2 remaining horses needed new supports. The chicken coop required mending after a coyote attack the previous month, and the vegetable garden that had once been Sarah's pride was now reduced to a few struggling rows of beans and squash that she tended with desperate efficiency. Yet despite the visible decay of infrastructure, Sarah had managed to keep the essentials functioning through sheer force of will. The well that Tom had dug with characteristic persistence still produced clean, cold water from depths that defied the desert's attempts to claim it. The small kitchen garden, though reduced in scope, continued to provide enough vegetables to supplement their stores, and the 2 horses, while aging and somewhat neglected, remained healthy enough to pull the wagon on the monthly trips to Dusty Creek for supplies. This particular morning dawned with the promise of another scorching day, the kind that could kill the unwary and challenge even the most experienced desert dwellers. Sarah emerged from the house before sunrise, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose center of gravity had shifted dramatically over the past months. Her pregnancy had progressed to the point where every movement required conscious thought, every task demanded twice the usual effort, and every night brought new aches and pains that reminded her of how vulnerable she had become. The baby kicked vigorously as she bent to collect eggs from the hen house, a strong, insistent movement that made her pause and press both hands against her swollen belly. Tom had been convinced the child was a boy, claiming he could tell by the way the baby moved during Sarah's pregnancy. "That's a fighter in there," he would say, grinning as he felt their child's restless energy. "A little frontiersman ready to take on the world." The memory brought tears to Sarah's eyes, as such memories always did. Tom had been so excited about becoming a father, so full of plans for their child's future. He had talked about teaching their son to ride and shoot, about passing down the skills necessary to survive and thrive in the territory. He had dreamed of expanding their small ranch, perhaps buying cattle, building a legacy that their children and grandchildren could inherit and improve upon. All of those dreams had died with him in the depths of the Copper Crown mine, crushed beneath tons of rock in what the mine foreman had called one of those tragic accidents that sometimes happen in this dangerous business. The company had paid for Tom's funeral and offered Sarah a small settlement, enough to cover immediate expenses but nowhere near sufficient to secure her long-term survival. The message had been clear. Take the money, sell the homestead, and return to whatever family might take in a pregnant widow. But Sarah had refused to leave. This harsh, unforgiving patch of desert was all she and Tom had ever owned, the only place where they had been truly happy together. The thought of abandoning it felt like betraying not just Tom's memory, but the dreams they had shared during their brief, joyful marriage. As she moved through her morning routine, feeding the chickens, checking the horses, drawing water from the well, Sarah tried not to think about the practical realities that pressed upon her with increasing urgency. The food stores were running dangerously low, and her credit at Morrison's General Store in Dusty Creek had been quietly suspended after her last payment came up short. The baby was due in less than a month, and she had no clear plan for managing childbirth alone in the isolation of the desert homestead. Dr. Harrison in Dusty Creek had offered to attend the birth, but his fee was beyond Sarah's means, and she was too proud to accept charity from a man who had already done more than enough by providing free consultations during her pregnancy. Mrs. Chen, the Chinese woman who ran the boarding house in town, had knowledge of midwifery and had hinted that she might be willing to help, but reaching her when labor began would require either perfect timing or considerable luck. More troubling than the practical challenges were the signs that Sarah's isolation was attracting the wrong kind of attention. Twice in the past month, she had spotted riders observing the homestead from distant hills, men who disappeared whenever she looked directly at them, but whose presence filled her with unease. Tom had warned her about the predators who watch for signs of weakness, who saw a woman alone as an opportunity for easy profit through theft, intimidation, or worse. The Winchester rifle that hung above the fireplace was loaded and ready, and Sarah had practiced with it enough to hit targets at reasonable distances. But she harbored no illusions about her ability to defend herself against multiple attackers, especially in her current condition. 8 months pregnant, she moved slowly, tired easily, and would be at a severe disadvantage in any physical confrontation. These dark thoughts were interrupted by a sound that didn't belong to the morning symphony of desert life. The labored breathing and irregular hoofbeats of a horse being ridden hard by someone in distress. Sarah straightened from the chicken coop, her hand instinctively moving to the old Colt revolver that she now carried constantly in her apron pocket. A lone rider approached from the south, weaving in his saddle with the erratic movement of someone who was either drunk, injured, or both. Even from a distance, Sarah could see dark stains on his shirt that looked suspiciously like blood. His horse, a fine bay gelding that had clearly been pushed beyond its limits, stumbled as it neared the homestead fence, and the rider swayed dangerously before catching himself on the saddle horn. Every instinct screamed at Sarah to retreat to the house and bar the door. A wounded stranger arriving at an isolated homestead rarely brought anything but trouble, and she was in no condition to handle complications. But as she watched, the rider lost his grip entirely and toppled from his horse, hitting the hard-packed earth with a sound that made her wince in sympathy. He lay motionless in the dust 20 yards from her front gate, and Sarah could see the steady seepage of blood into the thirsty desert soil beneath him. His horse, freed from its burden, wandered a few steps away and stood with its head hanging low, exhausted and confused. The man was dying. Whatever violence had brought him to her doorstep, whatever crimes he might have committed or enemies he might have made, right now he was simply another human being in desperate need of help. And despite every practical consideration that argued against involvement, Sarah found herself walking toward him with the revolver ready, but not quite aimed. Tom had always said that her compassion was both her greatest virtue and her most dangerous weakness. "You've got a heart big enough to save the world, darling," he would tease her. But someday that heart's going to get you into trouble you can't get out of. Perhaps this was that day, but Sarah discovered that the prospect of watching another person die while she did nothing was worse than whatever risks helping him might entail. As she approached the fallen stranger, Sarah could see that he was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair matted with sweat and blood, and clothes that had once been of good quality, but were now torn and stained with the evidence of hard travel and recent violence. A gun belt circled his waist, but the holster was empty. Whatever confrontation had left him wounded had also cost him his weapon. "Sir," she called softly, maintaining a careful distance of several feet. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, brown as creek water and filled with pain that seemed to extend far beyond physical injury. For a moment they struggled to focus on her face, and she could see him trying to process his surroundings and circumstances. "Water," he whispered, the word barely audible through cracked lips. "Please, water." Sarah hesitated, calculating risks and possibilities. Helping him would mean leaving herself vulnerable, potentially bringing unknown dangers into her home. But leaving him to die would violate every principle her father had taught her about Christian charity and human decency. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty churning in her stomach. "Jake," he managed, his voice gaining slightly in strength. "Jake Morrison. Was riding north when..." He paused, struggling with either pain or memory. "Got bushwhacked near Saguaro Springs. 3 men. Took everything." The name Morrison stirred something in Sarah's memory, though she couldn't immediately place it. More urgent was the man's obvious need for medical attention. The bullet wound in his shoulder was serious, and he had lost enough blood to leave him weak and disoriented. "I'm going to help you to the house," Sarah decided, making yet another choice that could change everything. "But I'm keeping this gun handy, and I know how to use it." Jake Morrison nodded weakly, understanding and accepting the terms of her assistance. "Yes, ma'am, just please don't let me die out here." Getting him to the house proved to be an ordeal that tested the limits of Sarah's strength and endurance. Morrison was nearly dead weight, barely able to support himself even with her help, and by the time she maneuvered him through the front door and onto the spare cot in what had been Tom's workshop, both of them were exhausted and fighting off waves of dizziness. The workshop still bore traces of Tom's presence, tools hanging in neat rows on the walls, half-finished projects abandoned when death claimed their creator. The lingering scent of wood shavings and leather oil that had been his constant companions. Sarah tried not to think about the symbolism of bringing a wounded stranger into this sanctuary of memory as she focused on the immediate task of keeping him alive. The bullet wound in Morrison's shoulder was serious, but not immediately fatal, assuming infection could be prevented. Sarah had enough experience with injuries. Tom had come home from the mine with various cuts, burns, and sprains over the years, to clean and dress the wound with reasonable competence. As she worked, cutting away his bloodied shirt and cleaning the injury with precious water and whiskey, Morrison drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering words she couldn't quite understand. It was during one of these delirious episodes that he said something that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins and her hands still on the bandage she was tying. "Tom Mitchell," he mumbled, his unfocused eyes staring at something only he could see. "Stupid fool. Shouldn't have been there when we..." "The gold." Sarah's world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What did you say?" But Morrison had slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving her alone with words that felt like a dagger thrust directly into her heart. Tom Mitchell, her husband's name, spoken by a stranger she had never seen before, in the context of gold and what sounded suspiciously like regret or guilt. She finished bandaging the wound with hands that trembled for reasons that had nothing to do with exhaustion or the physical demands of the task. Then she settled into the chair beside the cot, the revolver heavy in her lap, and prepared to wait for Jake Morrison to regain consciousness and explain how he knew her dead husband's name. The afternoon stretched endlessly as Sarah sat vigil beside the unconscious stranger. Through the workshop's single window, she could see the sun tracking its relentless path across the merciless blue sky, and with each passing hour, her certainty grew that Morrison's delirious words had not been random babbling, but fragments of memory fighting their way to the surface. The name Morrison had finally clicked into place in her mind. Morrison's General Store in Dusty Creek, where she had maintained credit until recently. The proprietor was Owen Morrison, a portly man in his 50s, who had always been cordial enough when Tom was alive and money was flowing freely, but who had turned increasingly cold and distant after Tom's death, and Sarah's financial situation became precarious. Could this wounded stranger be related to the storekeeper? And if so, what possible connection could either of them have to Tom's death in the mine collapse? As evening approached and the desert began its transformation from furnace heat to the bitter cold that could kill the unwary, Morrison's breathing grew steadier and his color improved slightly. Sarah's nursing had succeeded in pulling him back from death's threshold, but with recovery would come consciousness, and with consciousness would come the reckoning that Sarah both dreaded and desperately needed. She rose stiffly from her chair, her back protesting after hours of uncomfortable vigilance, and moved to the window to check on Morrison's horse. The animal had wandered closer to the house and was now grazing on the sparse grass near the well, apparently recovered from its hard journey. It was a fine-looking gelding, well cared for and obviously valuable, not the mount of a common drifter or petty criminal. The implications of this observation added another layer of complexity to the mystery. If Jake Morrison could afford such a horse, he was either successful in some legitimate endeavor or very successful in illegitimate ones. Either possibility suggested resources and connections that could prove dangerous for a woman alone in the desert. As darkness fell and Sarah lit the oil lamp that would serve as her companion through another long night of uncertainty, she found herself thinking about Tom and the conversations they had shared about the dangers of frontier life. He had always been protective of her, sometimes to the point of being overprotective, but his warnings about the predators who haunted the edges of civilization had proven all too prophetic. "There are men out here who see kindness as weakness, darling," he had told her on more than one occasion. "Men who will take advantage of decent people and feel no shame about it. You've got to be careful who you trust, especially if something ever happens to me." Something had happened to him, and now Sarah was facing exactly the kind of situation he had warned her about. But as she settled back into her chair beside the unconscious Morrison, she realized that her situation might be even more dangerous than Tom had imagined. Because if her growing suspicions were correct, the greatest threat to her safety might not be a random stranger seeking to exploit her vulnerability, but someone with a very specific connection to her husband's death. The lamp flame flickered in the desert wind that found every crack and crevice in the old adobe walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock Sarah's attempts to find peace in her vigil. Outside, a coyote called to its mate, the sound mournful and wild across the empty land, and Sarah found herself wondering if she would live to hear that sound again after learning whatever truth Jake Morrison carried with him. The baby kicked restlessly inside her, responding to her tension and anxiety with movements that reminded her of everything she had at stake. Not just her own life, but the life of the child Tom would never see. The future that hung in the balance as she waited for a wounded stranger to wake up and either confirm or dispel her worst fears. As the night deepened and Morrison's breathing grew stronger, Sarah gripped the revolver more tightly and prepared herself for whatever revelations the dawn might bring. One way or another, she would have answers to the questions that had been haunting her for 6 months. And if those answers proved to be what she feared, she would have to decide what price she was willing to pay for justice in a land where the law was often nothing more than what a person could enforce with their own hands. Dawn crept across the desert floor like spilled blood, painting the eastern horizon in shades of crimson and gold that seemed to herald either salvation or damnation. Sarah had dozed fitfully in her chair through the long night, startling awake at every sound, every shift in Morrison's breathing, every whisper of wind through the gaps in the adobe walls. Her back ached from the uncomfortable vigil, her neck was stiff from sleeping, sitting up, and the baby had been restless throughout the night, responding to her anxiety with constant movement that made rest nearly impossible. But Morrison was alive, and as the first light filtered through the workshop's single window, she could see that his color had improved significantly. The fever that had burned through him during the night was breaking, and his breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of genuine healing sleep, rather than the shallow, labored pattern of someone fighting for life. Sarah rose carefully from her chair, her hand pressed to her lower back where the pain had settled into a constant, grinding ache. 8 months pregnant and spending the night in a hard wooden chair was not a combination her body appreciated, and she moved with the stiff, careful gait of someone whose physical reserves were nearing their limits. The baby kicked hard as she stretched, a strong, insistent movement that made her gasp and grab the edge of the work table for support. The contractions she had been experiencing over the past few weeks were becoming more frequent and more intense, though they hadn't yet settled into the regular pattern that would signal the onset of actual labor. Dr. Harrison had warned her that stress could trigger premature birth, and the events of the past day had certainly provided more stress than any pregnant woman should have to endure. "Easy, little one," she murmured, rubbing circles on her belly in the soothing motion that sometimes calmed the baby's more vigorous movements. "Mama's handling things as best she can." A soft groan from the cot drew her attention back to Morrison, who was stirring for the first time since losing consciousness the previous evening. His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the dim light as they struggled to focus on his surroundings. For a moment, confusion clouded his features as he tried to reconcile where he was with his last clear memories. Sarah moved closer but remained out of arm's reach, the revolver once again in her hand, though not quite pointed at him. She had learned during her months alone that survival sometimes required projecting strength, even when you felt anything but strong. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "You're looking much better." Morrison tried to sit up, winced at the pain in his shoulder, and settled back against the thin pillow with a grimace. "You saved my life," he said simply, his voice hoarse but much clearer than it had been the previous day. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." "Maybe you can," Sarah replied, her tone taking on an edge that made Morrison's eyes sharpen with sudden wariness. "By explaining what you meant when you mentioned Tom Mitchell yesterday." The change in Morrison's expression was immediate and unmistakable. The gratitude in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a guarded caution that confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions. He knew exactly what she was talking about, and his knowledge was something he had hoped to keep hidden. "I don't know what you mean," he said carefully, but the lie was written plainly across his face. "My husband," Sarah continued, her voice growing harder with each word, "Tom Mitchell. You mentioned his name while you were fevering, said something about him being a fool and something about gold. I want to know what you meant." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting between Sarah's face and the gun in her hands. She could almost see him calculating odds and possibilities, trying to determine how much she actually knew versus how much she was guessing. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said finally, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than physical exhaustion. "Some truths are better left buried with the dead." "The only thing buried is my husband," Sarah snapped, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "In a grave I visit every Sunday, mourning a man who died in what everyone told me was a tragic accident. But you're suggesting it was something else, aren't you?" Morrison closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something fundamental had changed. The careful guardedness was gone, replaced by what looked almost like relief. The expression of a man who had been carrying a terrible burden and was finally ready to set it down. "It wasn't an accident," he said quietly, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. The confirmation hit Sarah like a physical blow, even though part of her had been expecting it. She had suspected somewhere in the depths of her heart that Tom's death had felt wrong from the beginning. Too convenient, too final, too perfectly timed to eliminate a problem that someone needed eliminated. But hearing the truth spoken aloud by someone who obviously knew the details felt like having the earth shift beneath her feet. "Tell me," she commanded, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. "Tell me everything." Morrison studied her face for a moment, perhaps recognizing that the woman holding a gun on him was far more dangerous than her pregnant condition and modest demeanor might suggest. "Your husband found something at the mine," he began slowly. "A vein of gold that the Copper Crown Company didn't know about. High-grade ore, richer than anything they'd pulled out of that mountain in 5 years of operation." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Tom had mentioned unusual rock formations in his section of the mine. had speculated about potential mineral deposits, but he had never said anything about actually discovering gold. He had been excited about something in the weeks before his death, more optimistic about their financial future than he had been in months. But she had attributed his improved mood to the approach of their baby's birth. Tom was an honest man, Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength as the confession poured out of him. He planned to report the discovery to the company according to his contract, split the profits according to the standard agreement. But word got out somehow, reached the wrong ears, and suddenly there were people who saw his find as a threat to their own interests. What people? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. My brother, for one, Morrison said with a bitter laugh. Owen Morrison, who owns the general store in Dusty Creek, also owns shares in 3 different mining operations, has his fingers in every profitable venture within 50 miles of here, and has never met a dollar he couldn't figure out how to steal. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Owen Morrison, the storekeeper who had been friendly enough when Tom was alive and Sarah had money to spend, but who had turned cold and distant after Tom's death, who had cut off her credit and suggested she might be better off selling the homestead and moving back east, where a woman alone wouldn't face such hardships. Owen had partners, Jake continued, his confession gaining momentum like a rock slide. Men who saw Tom's discovery as a threat to their own mining claims and a potential disaster for their carefully laid plans. If word got out that there was high-grade gold in the Copper Crown mine, it would bring in prospectors from across the territory, create competition that could drive down the value of their existing operations, maybe even lead to the company losing their exclusive rights to the area. So they killed him, Sarah whispered, the words barely audible above the desert wind that rattled the workshop's single window. They made it look like an accident, Morrison said, his voice now thick with emotion that sounded genuinely painful. Cave-in caused by faulty support timbers that had been deliberately weakened. Tom was found under a pile of rock with his skull crushed, and everyone assumed he had been in the wrong place when the tunnel collapsed. Sarah felt the room spinning around her, nausea rising in her throat as the full implications of Morrison's words sank in. But he wasn't killed by the cave-in. He was dead before the first stone fell, Morrison confirmed, tears now streaming down his weathered cheeks. Someone had hit him from behind with a mining pick while he was examining the gold vein. The cave-in was just to cover up the evidence and make it look like an industrial accident. The clinical details of her husband's murder struck Sarah like physical blows. Tom, excited about his discovery and probably planning how the gold might change their lives, ambushed and killed by men motivated by nothing more than greed and the desire to eliminate competition. How do you know all this? She asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Jake Morrison's face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine anguish. Because I was there. Because I helped them do it. The confession hung in the air between them like the smell of gunpowder after a shooting. Sarah stared at the man she had saved, the man whose life she had preserved with her own hands, and felt something cold and terrible crystallizing in her chest. A fury so pure and focused that it seemed to burn away everything else. You killed my husband. I held him while Owen struck the blow, Morrison said, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine remorse. Then I helped them set up the cave-in to make it look accidental. We told ourselves it was quick, that he didn't suffer, but that doesn't make it right. Nothing makes it right. Sarah's vision blurred. Whether from tears or rage, she couldn't tell. The baby kicked frantically inside her, responding to her emotional turmoil with movements so violent they made her gasp. But she barely noticed the physical discomfort, all her attention focused on the man who had just confessed to murdering the only person she had ever truly loved. Why? She managed to ask through the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Why are you telling me this? Because those same partners tried to kill me 3 days ago, Morrison replied, his voice growing steadier as he continued his confession. Because I developed a conscience and threatened to expose the whole operation. Because they decided that loose ends needed to be tied up permanently, and I had become the loosest end of all. He struggled to sit up slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. I've been carrying this guilt for 6 months, Mrs. Mitchell. Drinking myself to sleep every night, Seeing your husband's face every time I close my eyes, watching you struggle alone on this homestead and knowing I was responsible for your suffering. When those bullets started flying at Saguaro Springs, part of me was almost relieved. Maybe this was justice finally catching up with me. Sarah stood slowly, the revolver steady in her hands despite the trembling that seemed to start in her bones and radiate outward through her entire body. Justice, she repeated, tasting the word like something bitter and metallic. I know you have every right to pull that trigger, Morrison said, his voice remarkably calm for a man facing death. I've had it coming for months, but if you let me live long enough to heal up, I swear on my mother's grave that I'll help you get the men who ordered your husband's death. Owen and his partners. They're the ones who planned it, who profited from it. They're the ones who should pay the real price. The ones who should pay, Sarah echoed, shaking her head slowly. No, Mr. Morrison, you all should pay. Every single one of you who had a hand in Tom's murder. Morrison nodded, acceptance evident in his expression. You're right. We all should. Sarah looked down at him, this killer who had slept under her roof, who had drunk her water and accepted her mercy while harboring the truth about Tom's murder. The irony was almost unbearable. In trying to save a stranger's life, she had nursed back to health the very man who had helped destroy hers. But as she stood there with the gun pointed at Jake Morrison's heart, Sarah realized that simply pulling the trigger would be too quick, too merciful. This man had taken everything from her husband, her security, her future, her child's father. He deserved something more than a swift death. He deserved to suffer the way she had been suffering for 6 months. Tell me about the gold, she said suddenly, a new plan beginning to form in her mind. Where exactly did Tom find it? Morrison looked confused by the change of subject. In the deepest section of his tunnel, about 200 feet from the main shaft. Vein runs horizontal through a layer of quartz, maybe 3 feet wide, and showing color all the way across. How much gold? Enough to make everyone involved rich beyond their wildest dreams, Morrison said. High-grade ore that would assay out at maybe $40, $50 per ton. Could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars if properly worked. Sarah felt her heart racing as the implication sank in. According to Tom's contract with the Copper Crown Company, a copy of which she still had among his papers, any mineral discoveries in his assigned section were to be split 50-50 between the miner and the company. Tom's estate should be entitled to half of whatever gold came out of that tunnel, half of hundreds of thousands of dollars, enough money to ensure that her child would never want for anything, would never face the kind of grinding poverty that had forced Sarah to consider abandoning the homestead. Enough to build the life that she and Tom had dreamed about during their brief, happy marriage. But first, she had some debts to collect. Get up, she said quietly, her voice carrying a new note of deadly purpose. Morrison looked confused. Ma'am, I said get up. You're strong enough to talk. You're strong enough to walk. Understanding began to dawn in Morrison's eyes, along with something that might have been fear mixed with a strange kind of respect. What are you planning to do? Sarah's smile was as cold as winter wind across the desert. I'm going to give you the same chance you gave my husband, Mr. Morrison. None at all. The next hour was a blur of preparation and grim purpose. Sarah forced Morrison at gunpoint to dress in his torn and blood-stained clothes, ignoring his weak protests about his injuries and the risk of reopening his wounds. She gathered rope from Tom's supplies, water for herself but not for him, and the wooden sign she had hastily painted while he was unconscious. A piece of old barn wood with crude letters that spelled out a message she intended to leave for anyone who might happen upon what was about to unfold. As they prepared to leave the workshop where she had saved his life only to discover he had destroyed hers, Morrison made one last attempt to bargain for mercy. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, his voice carrying a desperate edge. Sarah, I know this doesn't change anything, but I am genuinely sorry for what we did to Tom. If I could bring him back, if I could undo any of it. But you can't, Sarah interrupted, her voice as final as a gravestone inscription. And that's why you're going to die out there in the desert, alone and afraid, just like you left my husband to die alone in that mine. As she prodded him toward the door with the barrel of her revolver, Sarah felt something shift inside her, a transformation from grieving widow to something harder and more dangerous. The desert had a way of changing people, of stripping away the civilized veneer to reveal what lay beneath. And what lay beneath Sarah Mitchell's gentle exterior, she was discovering, was a capacity for justice that even surprised her. Jake Morrison was about to learn what frontier justice looked like when it wore the face of a pregnant woman who had lost everything and found the strength to take it back. The ancient cottonwood tree stood like a monument to endurance in the vast emptiness of the Arizona desert, its gnarled trunk thick enough to shelter a dozen men, and its bare branches reaching toward the pitiless sky with the desperate persistence of something that had learned to survive where nothing else could. The tree had been a landmark for as long as anyone could remember, a waypoint for travelers and a gathering place for the scattered ranchers and prospectors who called this harsh land home. Today, it would serve as something else entirely. Sarah forced Jake Morrison to walk the half-mile from her homestead to the cottonwood at gunpoint, her revolver never wavering despite the exhaustion that weighed on her like a physical burden. The morning sun was already brutal, promising another day of killing heat, and each step across the rocky ground sent jolts of pain through her back and legs. The baby seemed to sense her distress, moving restlessly inside her, with kicks and turns that made her breathing shallow and her steps unsteady. Morrison walked ahead of her, his wounded arm bound against his chest, moving with the careful gait of a man who understood that his life hung by the thinnest of threads. He had tried several times during their journey to engage her in conversation, to appeal to her mercy or her Christian charity, but Sarah had rebuffed each attempt with stony silence. There was nothing he could say that would change what was about to happen. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said as they reached the tree, his voice carefully measured despite the fear she could see in his eyes. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but this isn't who you are. Tom wouldn't want you to—" "Don't you dare speak his name!" Sarah cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "You forfeited the right to mention my husband when you helped murder him for 30 pieces of silver." She gestured with the gun toward the tree's massive trunk. "Sit down, back against the tree." Morrison hesitated, his eyes darting around the empty landscape, as if hoping for rescue that would never come. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mountains that shimmered like mirages in the morning heat. No help was coming. No salvation awaited. There was only Sarah, her gun, and the justice she intended to dispense under the merciless Arizona sun. "Please," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I have family. A sister in California who depends on—" "Tom had family too," Sarah replied coldly. "A wife who loved him and a child he'll never meet. Sit down." Morrison's shoulders sagged in defeat as he lowered himself to the ground, his back against the rough bark of the ancient tree. The movement clearly caused him pain, but Sarah found she felt no sympathy for his discomfort. Let him hurt. Let him feel a fraction of the agony he had caused her. From her coat, Sarah pulled the length of hemp rope she had taken from Tom's workshop, the same rope he had used to secure loads in their wagon, to tie down equipment, to perform the 100 mundane tasks that kept a frontier homestead functioning. Now it would serve a darker purpose. "Put your hands behind the tree," she commanded. Morrison looked up at her, and for a moment she saw not the killer who had destroyed her life, but simply a frightened man facing death in one of its cruelest forms. The desert showed no mercy to those caught unprepared, and being tied to a tree without water under the Arizona sun was a death sentence that could take days to complete. "Mrs. Mitchell," he tried one last time. "Sarah, I know I don't deserve mercy, but—" "Put your hands behind the tree," she repeated, her voice carrying the kind of implacable authority that brooked no argument. Morrison complied slowly, his movements those of a man accepting his fate. Sarah bound his wrists with quick, efficient knots that spoke of years spent managing livestock and equipment. The rope was rough hemp that would chafe and cut if he struggled, but she found herself caring nothing for his comfort. Let every movement remind him of what he had done. When she was satisfied that the bonds were secure, Sarah stepped back and studied her handiwork. Jake Morrison, the man who had helped murder her husband for gold he would never live to spend, sat helpless against the cottonwood with his head bowed in what might have been prayer or simple despair. "Do you know what the desert does to a man without water, Mr. Morrison?" Sarah asked conversationally, as if discussing the weather or the price of cattle. Morrison looked up, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since his confession. "Yes, ma'am, I know." "Tell me," Sarah said, settling herself on a nearby rock with the careful movements of a woman 8 months pregnant. "I want to hear you describe what you're going to experience over the next few days." Morrison's throat worked convulsively, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "First comes the thirst, not ordinary thirst, but something that claws at your throat like a living thing. Your mouth gets so dry you can't swallow, can't speak properly. Then the sun starts cooking you from the outside while your body burns itself up from the inside." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Go on." "The hallucinations start on the second day," Morrison continued, his voice growing hoarser with each word. "You see water where there's only sand, shade where there's only sun. Your mind starts playing tricks, showing you things that aren't there, people you've known, places you've been. And then," Morrison closed his eyes briefly before continuing, "by the third day, if you last that long, your kidneys start shutting down. The pain becomes constant, burning through your whole body. Some men go mad before they die. Others just fade away." "Tom didn't get 3 days," Sarah observed quietly. "He got a pick handle to the skull and a few seconds of terror before everything went black. You're getting a much better deal than he did." She rose from her rock and pulled the wooden sign from her coat, a piece of old barnwood that she had painted the night before while Morrison slept. With quick, efficient movements, she nailed it to the tree trunk just above his head, the sound of hammer on nail echoing across the empty desert. "Let him starve." The words were crude but clear, painted in whitewash that stood out starkly against the weathered wood. Anyone who happened upon this scene in the days to come would understand exactly what had transpired here and why. Morrison craned his neck to read the sign, then let his head fall back against the tree with a sound that might have been resignation or relief. "You're going to leave me here to die." "I'm going to leave you here to pay for what you did," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." She turned away from him, then paused and looked back. "Your brother Owen and his partners? Where can I find them?" "Owen keeps ledgers hidden in his store," Morrison said, his voice already growing hoarse from the dry air. "Records of all the illegal mining operations, all the bribes, all the murders. Behind the false wall in his office, there's a safe. The combination is his wife's birthday, October 15, 1838. Sarah memorized the information, filing it away for future use. She would need evidence to bring down the rest of the conspiracy, and Morrison's final gift might be the key to ensuring that all of Tom's killers face justice. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Morrison's laugh was bitter and painful. "Because they tried to kill me when I grew a conscience. Because they deserve what's coming to them just as much as I do. Maybe more." Sarah nodded once, accepting the information without gratitude. Morrison's cooperation didn't earn him forgiveness or mercy. It simply made her task of hunting down his accomplices easier. "Mrs. Mitchell," Morrison called as she began walking away. "Sarah, I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know, killing your husband was the worst thing I've ever done. I've regretted it every day since." Sarah paused without turning around. "Good," she said simply. "I hope that regret follows you all the way to hell." As she walked back toward her homestead, Sarah could hear Morrison calling after her, his voice growing hoarse as he pleaded for water, for mercy, for a quick death instead of the slow agony she had condemned him to. She didn't look back. The desert morning was heating up rapidly, and by noon the temperature would reach levels that could kill an exposed man in hours rather than days. If Morrison was unlucky, and Sarah hoped he would be very unlucky indeed, he might linger for several days, experiencing every moment of suffering that the desert could inflict. She reached her house as the sun climbed toward its merciless zenith, the baby moving restlessly inside her, as if responding to the heat and her elevated emotions. Inside, she moved through her daily routine with mechanical precision, checking the animals, tending her garden, preparing a simple meal she barely tasted. Through her kitchen window, she could see the dark silhouette of the cottonwood tree against the bright sky. She couldn't see Morrison from this distance, but she knew he was there, tied to that ancient trunk with desert justice wrapped around his wrists like fate itself. Part of her, the part that had been raised to be a good Christian woman by parents who believed in forgiveness and redemption, whispered that what she had done was wrong. That murder, even the murder of a murderer, was a sin that would stain her soul and damn her in the eyes of God. But a larger part of her, the part that had carried Tom's child through 6 months of grief and struggle, felt a satisfaction so deep and complete that it frightened her with its intensity. Jake Morrison was getting exactly what he deserved, no more and no less. Justice might be slow in coming to the Arizona territory, but it was thorough when it finally arrived. As the day wore on and the temperature soared past 100 degrees, Sarah found herself wondering how long Morrison would last. Strong men had been known to survive 3 or 4 days in such conditions, while weaker ones succumbed within hours. Morrison seemed reasonably tough, which meant his suffering would be prolonged, exactly as Sarah had intended. The afternoon brought a brief respite when clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising rain that might have provided Morrison with life-saving moisture. But the clouds passed without releasing their burden, leaving only the mockery of false hope and the intensification of heat that came when humidity mixed with desert temperatures. By evening, when Sarah looked toward the cottonwood tree through her bedroom window, she could see buzzards circling overhead, not landing yet, but waiting with the patient hunger of scavengers who understood that death was only a matter of time. She slept better that night than she had since Tom's death. The sleep of someone who had taken the first step toward balancing scales that had been weighted against her for too long. In her dreams, she saw Tom's face, not as it had been in the moments before his murder, but as it was during their happiest times together, smiling, laughing, full of hope for their future. When she woke the next morning, her first thought was of Morrison tied to the tree, probably still alive but weakening with each passing hour. The knowledge filled her with a grim satisfaction that she made no attempt to soften or rationalize. Justice had many faces, she was learning. Sometimes it wore the robes of judges and the badges of lawmen. Sometimes it carried the authority of governments and the weight of civilization behind it. And sometimes it wore the face of a pregnant widow who had discovered that the gentle virtues of mercy and forgiveness were luxuries she could no longer afford. As Sarah prepared for another day in her campaign against the men who had murdered her husband, she reflected on how much she had changed since that terrible morning when she had learned of Tom's death. The naive young woman who had married for love and believed that goodness would always triumph over evil was gone, replaced by someone harder and more pragmatic. Someone who understood that in a land where the law was often absent, justice was what you made it. And Sarah Mitchell was just getting started making justice for the men who had destroyed her life. The transformation was complete. The grieving widow had become something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose, and the will to see that those who had wronged her paid the full price for their crimes. Morrison would be the first payment, but he would not be the last. 3 days after leaving Jake Morrison to die under the cottonwood tree, Sarah woke to the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving fast across the desert floor, their hoofbeats drumming against the hard-packed earth with the urgent rhythm of men who had business that couldn't wait. She rolled out of bed as quickly as her advanced pregnancy allowed, her hand instinctively reaching for the revolver she now kept on the nightstand beside her at all times. Through the bedroom window, she could see dust clouds rising in the distance, still too far away to count the individual riders, but close enough to set her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The baby kicked frantically inside her, responding to her sudden tension with movements so violent they made her gasp and grip the windowsill for support. "Easy, little one," she whispered, pressing a calming hand to her belly. "Mama's going to handle this, whatever it is." But as she watched the approaching riders resolve into distinct figures, 4 men on horseback, riding with the purposeful determination of people who knew exactly where they were going and why, Sarah realized that handling this situation might require more than determination in a single revolver. She dressed quickly in her sturdiest clothes, checked the loads in both Tom's rifle and her own handgun, and positioned herself at the front window where she could observe the riders approach while remaining concealed behind the heavy wooden shutters. The contractions that had been increasing in frequency over the past few days were coming closer together now, a deep, rhythmic pressure that seemed to echo the drumbeat of the approaching horses. The lead rider was a man she recognized even at a distance. Owen Morrison, Jake's brother, his portly frame unmistakable even in the saddle. Behind him rode three men she had never seen before, but their bearing and the casual way they wore their guns suggested they were professionals accustomed to violence. Not the random outlaws who occasionally passed through the territory but hired guns with the kind of cold competence that money could buy. They reined in their horses at the edge of her property and sat for a moment, surveying the homestead with the calculating gaze of predators sizing up potential prey. Sarah kept perfectly still, knowing that any movement might give away her position and the fact that she was watching their every move. "Mrs. Mitchell!" Owen Morrison called, his voice carrying clearly across the yard despite his obvious attempt to sound reasonable and unthreatening. "We need to talk." Sarah remained silent, studying the positioning of the four men and noting how they had automatically spread out to cover different approaches to the house. These were not social callers or even angry relatives looking for answers about a missing brother. These were men who had come prepared for trouble and were positioning themselves to control the situation regardless of how she chose to respond. "We know you're in there, Sarah," Owen called again, using her first name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "We know what you did to Jake." Still Sarah said nothing, watching as one of the hired guns, a lean man with silver-streaked hair and cold eyes, dismounted and gestured for the others to spread out even further. The tactical positioning was professional and methodical, designed to cut off any possibility of escape and ensure that the house could be taken from multiple directions simultaneously. "This is Deputy Marshal Clayton from Tombstone," Owen announced as the silver-haired man approached the front porch with his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "He's here about Jake's disappearance. Now you can make this easy on yourself by coming out and talking to us, or we can come in and get you." Sarah almost laughed at the transparent lie. She had seen Deputy Marshal Clayton from Tombstone on several occasions when he visited Dusty Creek, and this silver-haired gunman was no more a lawman than she was a dance hall girl. Owen Morrison was apparently as poor a liar as he was a businessman, though Sarah supposed desperation might make even smart men do stupid things. "I know who you are," she called back, finally breaking her silence but remaining concealed behind the shutter. "You're Owen Morrison's partners in murder, the men who killed my husband for a handful of gold that you were too cowardly to find yourselves." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Sarah watched as the four men exchanged meaningful glances. Any pretense of legitimate law enforcement was abandoned in that moment, replaced by the kind of cold calculation that she had come to recognize as the hallmark of men who valued money more than human life. "Now that's a serious accusation," the fake marshal said, his voice carrying the kind of calm reasonableness that predators use to lure their prey into range. "Why don't you come out here and explain exactly what you mean by that?" "I mean that Jake Morrison confessed everything before he died," Sarah replied, putting deliberate emphasis on the past tense while watching carefully for their reactions. "How you murdered Tom for finding gold in his section of the mine. How you've been covering it up for 6 months. How you tried to kill Jake when he grew a conscience." "Before he died?" Owen Morrison's voice cracked slightly, betraying the first sign of genuine emotion she had heard from him. "What do you mean before he died? Where is my brother?" Sarah's smile was invisible behind the shutter, but the satisfaction in her voice was unmistakable. "Your brother got exactly what he deserved, Owen. Just like you're going to get." The threat seemed to galvanize the four men into action. The fake marshal gestured sharply to his companions, who began moving toward the house with the coordinated precision of men who had done this before. Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached the doors and windows she would need to defend. 30 seconds to decide whether to fight or flee. She chose to fight. The first shot came from Tom's rifle, fired through the gap in the front shutters at the fake marshal who was mounting the porch steps. The heavy .45-70 slug caught him center mass and pitched him backward off the porch in a spray of blood that painted the whitewashed boards crimson. The man hit the ground hard and lay still, his silver hair matted with blood and dust. The remaining three men scattered like startled quail, seeking cover behind water troughs and fence posts while shouting confused instructions at each other. Sarah levered another round into the rifle and sent it toward Owen Morrison, who was trying to shelter behind his horse. The bullet missed the man but struck the animal in the shoulder, and the horse screamed and reared, throwing Owen to the ground before galloping away across the desert. "You crazy bitch!" one of the gunmen shouted from behind the water trough. "We'll burn you out of there." Sarah responded by putting a revolver bullet through the wooden trough he was hiding behind, sending a geyser of precious water into the air and reminding all of them that in desert country, wasting water was considered one of the gravest sins a person could commit. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. She was telling them that she had enough ammunition and determination to waste even their most precious resource. But as Sarah reloaded with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline and the increasing pain of contractions, she realized that her situation was essentially hopeless. 3 men with rifles could keep her pinned down indefinitely, and eventually her ammunition would run out. Worse, the stress of the gunfight was clearly triggering the onset of labor, with contractions coming in waves so intense they left her breathless and shaking. The baby was coming, here now, in the middle of a gunfight with the men who had murdered his father. "Listen to me," Sarah called out during a lull in the shooting, her voice carrying despite the pain that was building in her lower back and abdomen. "Jake Morrison told me everything before I tied him to that cottonwood tree and left him to die. Everything about the gold, about the conspiracy, about all of you." "You're lying," Owen Morrison shouted back, but his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Am I?" Sarah gasped between contractions, fighting to keep her voice steady. "He told me about the ledgers you keep hidden in your store, Owen. Records of every illegal mining operation, every bribe, every murder. He told me exactly where to find them." This was partially a bluff. Jake had mentioned the ledgers, but hadn't provided specific details about their location. But it had the desired effect. She could hear frantic, whispered conferences among the 3 remaining men, the kind of urgent discussion that suggested they were reassessing their situation and their options. Another contraction hit, stronger than any of the previous ones, and Sarah bit her lip hard enough to draw blood to keep from crying out. The metallic taste filled her mouth, but she held on to consciousness through sheer will and the knowledge that any sign of weakness would encourage her attackers to press their advantage. "Those ledgers are evidence," she continued when she could speak again, her voice strained but still carrying clearly across the yard. "Evidence that I've already copied and hidden. Evidence that's already on its way to the real law in Tombstone and Phoenix." Another lie, but a plausible one, given the circumstances. The kind of precaution that a smart woman might think to take if she suspected her life was in danger. "If anything happens to me," Sarah added, putting every ounce of conviction she could muster into her voice, "if I disappear or die under mysterious circumstances, those copies will be sent directly to the Territorial Marshal's office. Every name, every crime, every detail Jake Morrison confessed before he died screaming your names." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Sarah to endure 3 more contractions, each one stronger and more insistent than the last. Her body was telling her in no uncertain terms that her baby was coming, whether she was ready or not, and the combination of stress and physical exertion was accelerating the process beyond her ability to control. When Owen Morrison finally spoke again, his voice had lost much of its earlier bluster and authority. "What do you want from us?" "Justice," Sarah replied simply, though the word came out more as a groan than a statement as another contraction peaked. "For Tom, for every other man you've murdered to protect your dirty money." "We can make a deal," Owen said desperately, his voice carrying the edge of panic that came from realizing that his careful plans were unraveling. "Money, gold, a share of the mine profits. Whatever you want." Sarah's laugh was bitter as alkali dust. "What I want is my husband back alive. Since you can't give me that, I'll settle for watching you all hang for his murder." The baby was definitely coming now, with contractions so strong and frequent that Sarah could barely function between them. She needed to end this confrontation soon, before pain robbed her of the ability to defend herself and her own. The labor came with the brutal intensity of a summer thunderstorm, overwhelming Sarah's senses and leaving her clinging to consciousness by pure will as her body prepared to bring new life into a world that had already seen too much death. She barely managed to drag herself from the workshop to her bedroom before the contractions consumed her completely. Each wave of pain more intense than anything she had experienced during the gunfight or the months of grief that had preceded it. Alone in her desert homestead, 8 months pregnant and surrounded by the aftermath of violence, Sarah Mitchell prepared to deliver her child with nothing but her own strength and the fierce determination that had carried her through 6 months of widowhood and the terrible justice she had just dispensed. The room spun around her as another contraction peaked, and she gripped the iron bed frame with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. Through the bedroom window, she could see smoke rising from where one of the hired guns had tried to set fire to her barn before the others called him off. The acrid smell mixed with the scent of blood and gunpowder that seemed to have soaked into the very walls of her home. "Not yet," she gasped to the baby moving inside her. "Not quite yet, little one. Let Mama get ready first." But her body had made its own decisions about timing, and the contractions were coming so close together now that she barely had time to breathe between them. The baby would arrive soon, whether she was prepared or not, and Sarah found herself facing the prospect of delivering her child while the bodies of violent men cooled in her yard. She managed to gather the supplies she had prepared weeks ago: clean sheets, boiled water that had cooled, the knife Tom had sharpened for cutting the cord, strips of cloth for swaddling. Each movement was agony, but she forced herself to complete the preparations with the methodical precision of someone who understood that survival often depended on attention to small details. As she arranged the birthing supplies on the table beside her bed, Sarah tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong during a birth attended by no one except the mother herself. She had helped deliver calves and foals over the years, had read every book on midwifery she could find after learning of her pregnancy. But human birth was different, more dangerous, more complex, with complications that could kill both mother and child in minutes. Another contraction built like a wave gathering strength far out at sea, and when it crashed over her, Sarah understood that the real work was beginning. The baby was moving down, getting ready to make his entrance into a world that would demand strength and courage from his very first breath. "Tom," she whispered to the empty room, tears streaming down her face as pain and grief mingled in ways that threatened to overwhelm her completely. "I wish you were here. I wish you could see your son." But Tom was gone, murdered for gold he had never lived to spend, and Sarah was facing this ultimate test of endurance alone. Just as she had faced everything else since that terrible day, when the mine foreman had arrived at her door, with his hat in his hands and sorrow in his eyes. The next contraction brought with it an overwhelming urge to push, and Sarah knew that her baby was ready to be born. She positioned herself as best she could, drawing on half-remembered instructions from her midwifery books and the practical experience of a woman who had spent her life working with animals and understanding the basic mechanics of birth. "Come on then," she gasped, bracing herself for the final phase of labor. "Come meet your mama, little fighter." The pain that followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a burning, tearing sensation that seemed to split her body in half while simultaneously filling her with a fierce, primitive joy. This was creation in its rawest form, life emerging from suffering, hope born from the ashes of despair. And then, with a rush of fluid and relief that left her gasping, her son slipped into the world with a cry that was both outrage and triumph. Sarah caught him in trembling hands, this perfect tiny life that Tom would never see, and wept tears that were equal parts sorrow and overwhelming love. "Hello, Thomas," she whispered, using the name she and Tom had chosen during those hopeful early months of pregnancy. "Your daddy would have loved you so much." Little Thomas Robert Mitchell was small but clearly healthy, with a full head of dark hair that reminded Sarah painfully of his father, and eyes that seemed to take in his new surroundings with the alert intelligence that she had always admired in Tom. As she cleaned him with shaking hands and wrapped him in the soft blankets she had prepared, Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her. Not just the physical aftermath of birth, but an emotional transformation that seemed to rearrange her very soul. She was no longer just a widow seeking justice for her murdered husband. She was a mother, responsible for protecting and nurturing this perfect, vulnerable life that depended on her for everything. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and empowering, filling her with a fierce protectiveness that made her previous desire for vengeance seem pale by comparison. Outside, the desert wind had picked up, and she could hear it rattling the shutters and carrying away the last traces of gun smoke from the morning's violence. The body of the hired gun she had killed still lay on her front porch, but that was a problem for later. Right now, her entire world had narrowed to the infant in her arms and the overwhelming need to keep him safe and warm and fed. Thomas latched onto her breast with the instinctive hunger of a newborn, and Sarah marveled at the simple miracle of this tiny person who had been growing inside her for months but was now a separate being with his own needs and desires. The sensation of nursing him was strange but deeply satisfying, a biological imperative that connected her to every mother who had ever lived and struggled and fought to protect her children. As afternoon faded into evening and the desert heat began to give way to the bone-deep cold that could kill the unwary, Sarah found herself making plans with the clarity that sometimes came after intense physical and emotional stress. The confrontation with Owen Morrison and his hired guns had been won, but it was only the first battle in a war that would determine not just her own fate, but her son's future. The ledgers that Jake Morrison had mentioned were real. She was certain of that now, having seen Owen's reaction to her bluff about copying them. Those records would contain the evidence she needed to bring down the entire conspiracy, to ensure that all of Tom's killers faced justice and that the gold he had died discovering would provide security for his son. But getting to those ledgers would require careful planning and considerable risk. Owen Morrison and his partners were on the run now, but desperate men were dangerous men, and they would be looking for ways to eliminate the threat she represented. She would have to move quickly before they could regroup or bring in additional hired guns to finish what they had started. Through her bedroom window, Sarah could see the cottonwood tree where Jake Morrison had met his end 3 days earlier. Buzzards had been circling for the past day, and she knew that nature was already beginning the work of reclaiming what remained of her husband's killer. The sight filled her with a grim satisfaction that she made no attempt to moderate or deny. Justice had many faces, she was learning. Sometimes it came through courts and judges and the formal mechanisms of civilization. Sometimes it was delivered by sheriff's posses and territorial marshals with the authority of law behind them. And sometimes it was administered by a pregnant widow with a rifle, and the will to use it in defense of what she loved most. As Thomas slept in her arms, his tiny face peaceful and trusting, Sarah found herself thinking about the future she wanted to build for him. Not just financial security, though the gold from Tom's discovery would certainly provide that. More importantly, she wanted to create a world where justice meant something, where good people didn't have to live in fear of those who were stronger or more ruthless or simply willing to kill for profit. It was an ambitious goal for a woman alone in the desert with a newborn baby and a list of enemies who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But Sarah had discovered reserves of strength and determination that she hadn't known she possessed. Resources that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker in the face of impossible odds. Tomorrow she would begin the work of tracking down Owen Morrison and his partners, of gathering the evidence that would see them hanged for Tom's murder and countless other crimes. She would reclaim the gold that belonged to her husband's estate and use it to build the life that he had dreamed of for their family. But tonight, she simply held her son and marveled at the miracle of his existence. This perfect proof that love was stronger than death and that hope could bloom even in the harshest soil. Thomas Robert Mitchell had been born into a world of violence and injustice, but he would grow up knowing that his mother had fought to make that world better, no matter what the cost. Outside, the desert night settled over the land with its vast carpet of stars and its promise of both beauty and danger. Somewhere out there, evil men were planning their next move, calculating how to eliminate the threat that Sarah represented. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with a grieving widow who could be intimidated or killed like any other obstacle to their plans. They were wrong. They were dealing with a mother now, and there was no force on earth more dangerous than a woman fighting to protect her child. Sarah Mitchell's transformation was complete. The naive young bride who had believed in justice and mercy and the fundamental goodness of humanity was gone. replaced by someone harder and more pragmatic. Someone who understood that in a land where the law was often absent, protection was what you made it. And Sarah was just getting started making protection for the son who would carry his father's name and his mother's uncompromising determination to see justice done, whatever the cost. 2 weeks after Thomas's dramatic entrance into the world, Sarah made her first trip to Dusty Creek since before his birth, carrying her infant son in a sling she had fashioned from Tom's old work shirt and moving with the careful determination of a woman who had business that couldn't wait any longer. The baby traveled well, sleeping peacefully against her chest as their wagon bumped over the rocky desert road, seemingly oblivious to the significance of this journey for his future security. The town looked the same as always, a collection of weathered wooden buildings clustered around a main street that was more dust than road, populated by the usual mixture of miners, ranchers, and merchants who made their living from the harsh bounty of the Arizona territory. But Sarah noticed details she had never paid attention to before. Which buildings had clear sightlines to the street, which alleys offered escape routes, which rooftops might conceal a man with a rifle. Motherhood, she was discovering, had sharpened her instincts for danger in ways that grief alone had never accomplished. Morrison's General Store sat at the heart of the business district, its substantial two-story structure serving as both commercial center and residence for the family that owned it. Sarah had timed her arrival for midday, when the store would be busy with customers and Owen Morrison, if he was even still in town, would be distracted by the demands of commerce. She entered with Thomas in her arms, playing the part of a new mother in need of supplies. The other customers, mostly women from the surrounding ranches and mining camps, glanced over with the polite interest that new babies always attracted, unaware of the tension that crackled beneath Sarah's calm exterior. Owen Morrison stood behind the counter, looking older and more haggard than she remembered. The confrontation at her homestead had clearly taken its toll on him, and Sarah could see the nervous tension in the way his eyes darted constantly toward the door and windows. He was a man expecting trouble, which meant he probably wasn't expecting it from a seemingly harmless woman with a baby. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said when he noticed her, his voice carefully neutral despite the fear she could see in his eyes. "Congratulations on the baby. Fine-looking boy." "Thank you," Sarah replied sweetly, her voice betraying none of the cold fury that burned in her chest. Tom would have been so proud to see his son. The mention of her dead husband made Owen flinch visibly, confirming what Sarah had suspected, that her bluff about evidence and ledgers had left him uncertain about how much she actually knew versus how much she was guessing. Other customers in the store glanced over with polite sympathy, unaware that they were witnessing a deadly game of cat and mouse. "I need some things for the baby," Sarah continued, moving deeper into the store while carefully observing its layout. "And I was wondering, I heard Jake might have left some of Tom's personal effects here. Things that were in his locker at the mine when the accident happened. It was a fishing expedition designed to gauge Owen's reaction and gather information about his brother's fate. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Owen's face went pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the counter. Jake isn't here right now," he stammered, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. He had to leave town suddenly. Business matters." "I see," Sarah said with apparent disappointment. "Well, perhaps when he returns. I do hope he's well. It would be terrible if something happened to him out there in the desert." The implied threat hit its mark, and Sarah watched with satisfaction as Owen's composure cracked further. He knew exactly what had happened to his brother, and the knowledge was eating him alive with fear and uncertainty. "Actually," Sarah added, as if the thought had just occurred to her, "I wonder if I might use your back room for a moment. Thomas needs changing, and new mothers, well, you understand the urgency of these situations." Owen looked trapped between refusing a reasonable request and allowing her access to areas of his store that he clearly didn't want her to see. Customer courtesy and the presence of other shoppers won out over caution. "Of course," he said reluctantly, "right through that door." The back room was exactly as Jake Morrison had described it, cramped and cluttered, filled with inventory and personal belongings that spoke of a family business built over years of careful accumulation. Sarah's eyes swept the space efficiently while she pretended to tend to Thomas, who was actually sleeping peacefully and needed no attention whatsoever. There, pushed against the far wall and partially concealed by stacked crates, she could see the edge of what appeared to be a heavy wooden chest, the kind of secure storage that a man might use to hide documents he couldn't afford to have discovered. "Thank you so much," Sarah said as she emerged from the back room, Thomas still quiet in her arms. "You've been very kind, just as Jake always was." Owen's relief at her departure was palpable, but Sarah wasn't finished with her reconnaissance. She made several small purchases, baby clothes, basic supplies, while engaging Owen in seemingly innocent conversation that was actually designed to gather intelligence about his routine in the store's security. "I suppose you'll be closing early today," she observed as she prepared to leave. "It being Saturday and all." "Actually, I stay open until 7 on Saturdays," Owen replied automatically, then immediately looked as if he regretted sharing that information. "How dedicated of you," Sarah said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, I should be getting Thomas home before the afternoon heat becomes too much for him." As she drove her wagon out of Dusty Creek, Sarah's mind was already working through the details of what would need to happen next. Owen Morrison's nervous behavior confirmed that he was still in possession of the incriminating ledgers Jake had mentioned, and his predictable routine would make planning much easier. She would return that night after the store closed and the town settled into sleep. The evidence she needed was within reach, and with it would come the means to destroy the men who had murdered her husband and threatened her infant son. That evening, after feeding Thomas and settling him in his cradle with the devoted attention that had become second nature, Sarah prepared for what might be the most dangerous night of her life. She dressed in Tom's old work clothes, dark and practical garments that would help her blend into the shadows. She checked and rechecked her weapons, the revolver and a small knife that Tom had carried during his mining days. Most importantly, she reviewed the intelligence she had gathered about Owen's store, mentally mapping every detail Jake Morrison had provided about the location of the hidden ledgers. Behind the false wall in the office, secured in a combination safe that opened to his wife's birthday, October 15th, 1838. The ride back to Dusty Creek under cover of darkness was nerve-wracking, every shadow potentially concealing an enemy, every sound possibly announcing discovery. But Thomas slept peacefully in the makeshift crib she had constructed in the wagon bed, seemingly unaware that his mother was embarking on a mission that could determine the course of his entire life. She left the wagon and baby hidden in a grove of cottonwoods outside town, secured but close enough that she could reach them quickly if escape became necessary. Thomas would be safe there for the hour or two she needed to complete her mission, and if something went wrong, at least he would have a chance of being found by someone who would care for him. Breaking into Morrison's store proved easier than expected. The back door lock was old and yielded to patient work with tools she had borrowed from Tom's workshop. Sarah slipped inside like a shadow, moving by memory and instinct through the cluttered back room to the office she had glimpsed during her afternoon visit. The false wall Jake had described was expertly crafted, but not impossible to locate once you knew what to look for. Behind it, exactly as promised, sat a substantial safe with a combination lock. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she turned the dial, left to 10, right to 15, left to 38, and held her breath as the mechanism clicked open. Inside the safe, she found exactly what Jake Morrison had promised: ledgers, correspondence, maps, and financial records that documented years of illegal mining operations, claim jumping, bribery, and murder. Names, dates, amounts, locations, everything needed to bring down not just Owen Morrison, but an entire network of corruption that reached into territorial politics and federal land management. Sarah stuffed the most damaging documents into a canvas bag, careful to leave the safe looking as if it had been damaged by a random break-in rather than a targeted robbery. She took photographs of key pages using a small camera she had purchased from a traveling salesman, ensuring that she would have multiple copies of the most crucial evidence. As she prepared to leave, Sarah heard the sound that every burglar dreaded: footsteps on the front porch, followed by the rattle of keys in the lock. Owen Morrison was returning to his store hours earlier than his stated schedule, possibly because her afternoon visit had made him nervous about the security of his hidden evidence. Sarah moved quickly but quietly toward the back door, her escape route planned and rehearsed. But as she reached for the door handle, Thomas chose that moment to cry, a thin, hungry wail that carried clearly through the night air, from where she had hidden him outside town. The sound froze her blood, not because it revealed her location, but because it meant her baby needed her, and she was trapped inside a building with a man who would kill her without hesitation if he discovered her theft. The maternal instinct to respond to her crying child warred with the survival instinct that demanded she remain hidden until Owen passed by. Footsteps approached the office area, and Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the door, knife ready in one hand while she gripped the bag of evidence with the other. If Owen discovered the open safe, if he realized what was missing, she would have to fight her way out. "Hello," Owen called softly, his voice tense with suspicion. "Is someone there?" Sarah held her breath, willing Thomas to stop crying, praying that Owen would assume any sounds he heard came from the street rather than the interior of his store. Through the thin wall, she could hear him moving around, checking locks and examining his inventory for signs of disturbance. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps moved away from the office area. Sarah waited until she heard Owen climbing the stairs to his living quarters above the store, then slipped out the back door and into the night like smoke. The run back to where she had hidden Thomas felt like the longest journey of her life. Every shadow might conceal a pursuer, every sound might announce discovery. But when she reached the grove of cottonwoods and found her son safe in his makeshift crib, relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. "Shh, little one," she whispered as she lifted him to her breast, feeling his hungry suckling as both comfort and vindication. "Mama's here. Mama got what we needed." The ride home through the desert night was less tense, though Sarah remained alert for any signs of pursuit. The evidence bag rested securely beside Thomas's crib, its contents representing not just justice for Tom's murder, but financial security that would ensure her son never wanted for anything. Back at her homestead, as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah spread the stolen documents across her kitchen table and began the work of cataloging the evidence that would destroy Owen Morrison and his Confederates. What she found exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. The ledgers documented a criminal enterprise that had operated for more than 5 years, encompassing not just Tom's murder, but dozens of other crimes. Claim jumping, mineral theft, bribery of territorial officials, intimidation of witnesses, and at least 6 other murders disguised as mining accidents. The financial records showed profits in excess of $200,000, with detailed accounting of how the money had been divided among the conspirators. Most importantly for Sarah's immediate situation, the documents confirmed that Tom's section of the Copper Crown mine contained gold deposits worth an estimated $400,000. According to his contract, a copy of which Owen had helpfully filed with his other evidence, Tom's estate was entitled to 50% of any minerals discovered in his assigned area. Sarah Mitchell was not just a widow seeking justice. She was the rightful heir to a fortune that would make her one of the wealthiest women in the territory. But first, she had some hanging to arrange. 3 days later, a heavily armed federal posse rode into Dusty Creek with warrants for the arrest of Owen Morrison and 5 other men on charges, including murder, conspiracy, theft of federal mineral rights, and bribing territorial officials. The evidence Sarah had provided was so comprehensive and damning that resistance was futile. Owen Morrison was found in his store, apparently having spent the past several days drinking heavily and preparing for an outcome he knew was inevitable. He offered no resistance as the marshals placed him in shackles, but his eyes sought out Sarah where she stood with Thomas in her arms, watching from across the street. "You," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "You planned this from the beginning." "I planned justice," Sarah replied calmly, "for my husband and for every other man you murdered for money." The trials that followed made headlines throughout the territory and beyond. Sarah testified with calm precision about Jake Morrison's confession, the discovery of the evidence, and the systematic campaign of murder and theft that had been disguised as legitimate business operations. The press painted her as a tragic heroine, the widowed mother who had brought down a criminal empire through courage and determination. They never learned about Jake Morrison's slow death under the cottonwood tree, or about her midnight break-in at Owen Morrison's store. Some truths, Sarah had decided, were better left as secrets between herself and the desert that had witnessed them. The convictions were swift and the sentences harsh. Owen Morrison and 3 of his partners were hanged for murder in the first degree. 2 others received lengthy prison sentences. The mining claims they had stolen were returned to their rightful owners, and the illegal profits were distributed as restitution to the families of their victims. The gold claim from Tom's section of the mine was validated after extensive litigation, making Sarah the legal owner of mineral rights worth more than she had ever imagined. She found herself wealthy beyond her wildest dreams, with the resources to live anywhere, do anything, become anyone she chose. But she chose to remain in Arizona territory on the homestead that she and Tom had built together. She expanded the house, hired workers to develop the mine properly, and invested in other properties throughout the region. Thomas grew up surrounded by luxury but grounded in the values of hard work and justice that had defined his parents' brief marriage. Sarah never told him the full details of how his father had died or the lengths she had gone to secure justice, but she made sure he understood that some debts could only be paid in full. Years passed. Thomas grew into a strong, intelligent boy who showed his father's love for the land and his mother's fierce determination to protect what mattered most. Sarah never remarried, though she had plenty of suitors attracted by her wealth and beauty. She had loved completely once, and that was enough. On quiet evenings when Thomas was asleep and the desert winds sang through the cottonwood trees around her expanded homestead, Sarah would sometimes think about the choices she had made during those terrible weeks after Jake Morrison rode in her life. She felt no guilt about his death. He had earned it through his crimes. But she wondered sometimes if the woman who had tied him to that tree and walked away was someone Tom would have recognized. She decided that Tom would have understood. In a land where law was often absent and justice was what you made it, a woman did what she had to do to protect what mattered most. The frontier demanded strength from those who would survive it, and strength sometimes required choices that civilized society might condemn, but practical necessity made inevitable. The cottonwood tree still stood, larger now after years of good rain and careful tending. Sarah had removed the crude sign years ago, but she could still see the nail holes in the bark when the light was right. It served as a reminder that some debts could only be paid in blood, and that frontier justice, while harsh, was sometimes the only justice available to those with the courage to claim it. Sarah Mitchell had started as a grieving widow and transformed herself into something far more formidable. A woman who understood that in a world where the strong preyed upon the weak, survival required becoming strong enough to push back. Her story became legend in the territory, whispered around campfires and repeated in saloons as proof that even the most powerful men had reason to fear the justice that could be delivered by someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. And in the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson she could pass on to her son. That justice was not a gift to be waited for, but a responsibility to be claimed, regardless of the cost or the personal sacrifice required to see it done. And so ends the story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman who discovered that the greatest strength often emerges from the deepest loss, and that the most decisive justice is sometimes delivered not by courts and badges, but by individuals willing to risk everything for what they believe is right. Sarah's transformation from grieving widow to frontier avenger speaks to something fundamental about the human spirit, that when pushed beyond endurance, when faced with the choice between accepting injustice or becoming the instrument of reckoning, ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. Her story reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear when something more important than personal safety is at stake. In the harsh landscape of the Arizona territory, Sarah learned that protecting what you love sometimes requires becoming someone you never thought you could be. Her journey from victim to victor, from powerless widow to wealthy matriarch, illustrates the truth that our greatest challenges often reveal our greatest strengths, and that the price of justice, while sometimes terrible, is always worth paying when the alternative is allowing evil to triumph. Sarah Mitchell got exactly what she sought: justice for her husband, security for her son, and the satisfaction of knowing that those who take what doesn't belong to them will eventually face consequences, even if those consequences must be personally delivered. Her story stands as testament to the power of maternal love, the importance of moral courage, and the enduring truth that in a world where might often makes right, Sometimes the only way to restore balance is to become a force of nature yourself. What did you think of Sarah's journey from victim to victor? Have you ever faced a situation where the system failed and personal actions seemed like the only path to justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing how these stories of frontier courage and moral complexity resonate with your own experiences and beliefs about right and wrong. If this tale of a widow's terrible choices and ultimate triumph moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of frontier, justice, and the complex moral decisions that shape the American West. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might challenge your assumptions about courage, consequences, and the true meaning of justice. And remember, in a world that often seems tilted toward those who take what they want through force and deception, sometimes the only way to restore balance is to become the force that pushes back. Sarah Mitchell understood this truth, and her story stands as proof that even the most powerful predators have reason to fear the justice that can be delivered by someone who has lost everything and gained the terrible freedom that comes with having nothing left to lose.